Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. As you've probably been able to tell from the title, today's episode will be a little different from our usual ones. We will not be discussing one person today, but a loosely connected group of individuals who my guest has christened adventure capitalists. These people are behind what are known as exit projects, attempts to create private sovereign entities outside the jurisdiction of traditional nation-states. These projects often find their political and ideological basis in libertarianism, a way of thinking that presupposes individuals as above all else consumers in a society where the state has been subordinated to the needs and logic of the market. Whilst these exit projects could be interpreted positively, as a way of oppressed or overlooked people escaping the authoritarian governments that run so much of the world, the people that propose to make these exit projects are almost always wealthy Americans, who often work with dictators to get their exit projects off the ground. These projects can take the form of offshore artificial islands, suburbs of major US cities, or, in the future, they may take the form of virtual realities or space stations designed by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Especially in the light of the Epstein revelations, one has to ask the question, what do these adventure capitalists wish to do on their own private islands that they cannot do in San Francisco or New York? Here to discuss all of this with me is Raymond B. Craib, Professor in the Department of History at Cornell University in New York State. Raymond is the author of the upcoming book Adventure Capitalism, A History of Libertarian Exit from the Era of Decolonization to the Digital Age, which comes out next month. So if you enjoy our conversation, be sure to keep an eye on PM Press. Raymond and I discuss the origins of libertarianism in the United States, the bizarre tendency for libertarians and adventure capitalists to see themselves as under attack from a system that has allowed them to become unimaginably wealthy, and the prospect for the so-called exit projects in the years ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce the adventure capitalists. Hi Raymond, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. I'm looking forward to this episode, but I'm also slightly apprehensive because it's going to be a slightly different episode to my usual ones. We're not talking about one person today, but we're talking about a kind of collective, the adventure capitalists. That's your term rather than mine. You suggested this as a topic. Very simply, to start off with, how would you define an adventure capitalist, and why are they as a group important and interesting?
Well, thank you for having me and for agreeing to sort of take on a slightly different set of people here. I ended up using the term adventure capitalist to talk about people who essentially one could call libertarian, but libertarian in a U.S. frame. I mean, it's not totally specific to the U.S., of course, but I mean, in much of the world, I think libertarian, certainly in Spanish, libertario, is a term that largely is synonymous with anarchist, and the individuals I'm talking about here are not anarchists. I mean, I understand anarchists traditionally to be both against hierarchy, authority, the state, but also against capitalism. And so the individuals that I'm talking about here as adventure capitalists are hyper-capitalist. And they're not even actually, in some ways, they're not against the state per se. I mean, there's a sort of way in which we can talk about how they understand the state and what it is that they're agnostic. They're agnostic about the state, I guess is one way to put it. But they're certainly not agnostic about the market and about capitalism. They're very, fundamentalist believers. And so adventure capitalist is just the term that I wanted to use in part because a lot of the projects that I talk about in relationship to these individuals are venture capitalist schemes, venture capitalist undertakings. But there's also a kind of adventurous component to these projects in a way that is often the kinds of critiques that are made of the revolutionary left, right? This sort of adventurism of Che Guevara in Angola or Bolivia or something like this. And there's an accusation that's often made about the left, but here you have individuals who are engaging in activities that are kind of neo-colonial, if you want to call them that, forms of new forms of sort of dispossession and primitive accumulation in places that are decolonizing around the globe in the 60s and the 70s. So I try to use the term adventure capitalist as a way to signal who these individuals are and to stress their kind of libertarian bona fides.
Thank you. The word that you just mentioned, libertarianism, is a word that we're going to keep coming back to today. And I just wanted to delve into the history of that term, Raymond, the kind of recent history of that term, to sort of understand where these people have come from, because I think you'd agree that they haven't sprung out of a vacuum. They have quite clear ideological foundations and historical foundations. When I was preparing for this interview, I was subconsciously thinking of libertarianism and the kind of quite extreme conception of capitalism that you mentioned as being basically an Anglo-American idea. But then I kind of thought about the Austrian school of economic thought. Libertarianism obviously has quite a strong economic bent to it. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Austrian school kind of entails and why they're important to this group?
Yeah, this is not I should qualify this by saying this is certainly not an area in which I'm an expert by any means. But in some sense, right, I take you to be asking about people like Hayek, von Mises, and founders of the Mont Pelerin Society. And it's true, right? I mean, these are, so in the stuff that I do, in the work that I'm finishing or that's coming out in next month, I look at both contemporary projects, libertarian projects, what I call exit projects, but also earlier versions. And you're absolutely right to stress that, right, they don't come out of nowhere. There's a long genealogy here. And it's an important one because certainly the contemporary libertarians today in the United States who are engaged in some of these activities have a tendency to see themselves as sort of sui generis, as if, profound ideas only sort of developed in their brains and then they share them with the rest of us. When in fact there's a long tradition of many of these kinds of things. It's a fascinating story, I think, in particular in relationship to the United States, but it's not solely a U.S. story. But certainly folks such as Hayek, Rand, who, just doesn't seem to go away despite all the sort of crudeness, I think, in some ways of both her fiction and her nonfiction. But Rand, comes from Russia, moves to Southern California, deeply influenced by Hollywood. She's as much influenced, I think, by Hollywood as she is by New York City and by the Russian Revolution and what happens to her there. And certainly people that have written about Rand have been very clear about this. Lisa Duggan and Mean Girl, Corey Robin and his work, The Reactionary Mind. And so Rand is a very good example here. Murray Rothbard, Hayek, von Mises, they come out of a tradition that's, essentially one that sees a world in which markets rather than states should be sovereign, right? So the idea is to essentially not necessarily get rid of the state, but states exist in order to ensure that the market is sovereign. And they're deeply influential in the United States in the aftermath of World War II. And I think in part their influence, comes from a certain convergence of things. One of them being a strong sort of Chamber of Commerce, businessman's push back against Roosevelt's New Deal. Part of it is a kind of understanding, a conflation of socialism, communism, and fascism as the same thing, essentially, which is totalitarianism, right? They see totalitarianism as this kind of large scale, and of course, American liberals, right? Arthur Schlesinger and the folks who will populate the Kennedy administration share that basic kind of premise. So this is sort of where they're coming from. Many of them would not have called themselves libertarians. Ayn Rand would not have called herself a libertarian. I don't even know. I don't think Friedman would have, although he generally sort of moved in that direction over time, but they did share a number of things in common. I mean, I think they shared a fear of the masses, a kind of real concern about how the world could turn on a dime through sort of demagoguery and mass politics and things like this. So they shared a real faith in the free enterprise system, whatever that term might mean. It was very sort of loose and fluid, but certainly this kind of dedication to the market. They also shared a kind of faith in, or a sort of view of the world in which you start with the individual, not with the social. Very problematically so, because of course they also embraced a kind of politics about the family as well, not just the individual. And then they also had a strong, again, sort of ontology or worldview that associated freedom with private property rights. So freedom really was first and foremost defined as the ability to freely engage in contractual relations as an individual. And so, the last thing I'll say about that is, part of what's interesting is that for them, I think, to give them the benefit of the doubt and to not just sort of be, critical, I don't think they were necessarily opposed to concerns with and thinking about questions of equality and things like this, but they saw those things as derivative of the market, right? So if you have freedom in the marketplace, equality will ensue. Some of the individuals, though, who were part of this group did not believe that. Murray Rothbard very clearly said it's about freedom and equality is not an issue. And in fact, he went further and said egalitarianism is a totalitarian ideology. So you have these, whereas I think for many thinkers of the time that would see themselves on the left, they would see these things as having to happen simultaneously, not sequentially. You need freedom and equality simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you. It's probably helpful to mention at this stage that the last podcast I put out on Sunday was about Margaret Thatcher, who, in many ways, at least in the UK, represents the kind of electoral triumph of many of these concepts. She was obviously elected about 18 months before Ronald Reagan was elected in the United States, who represented many of the similar things. Something that I was thinking about quite a lot when you were talking about the conception of freedom as very much based around financial ideas, making money, entering into contractual obligations. That obviously there's an important element about the state there. There's I think the way that the Thatcherism and Reaganism are often thought about is this rolling back of the state, a slimming of the state. But if you look at the way, for example, that the miners' strikes were dealt with in the UK in the 1980s, or the Reagan administration dealt with something like the air traffic controllers strike, I can't remember what year that was in. These were not really small state responses. These were quite authoritarian responses, really. Putting down strikes in very violent ways, rolling back trade union rights. These are big state responses. This is people using the state against people, right? Do you think that the kind of adventure capitalist or libertarian claims about wanting to reduce the size of government is a bit of a farce? They don't really care about the size of the state exactly. It's just making sure that the state is doing what they want.
That's absolutely right. So the idea of the minimalist or ultra minimalist state has little to do with the size of the state. It has to do with the range of its functions. Right? That's the crux. And so you can find plenty of quotes from Friedman and others talking exactly about this, essentially saying that the only role of the state should be to, sort of enforce and to protect and so on and so forth. And it's about protecting property rights, national defense, and the like. And of course, that's a manifesto for a big state. The sort of military apparatus is expensive. Policing is expensive. Enforcement of patent laws, ensuring that questions of fraud are investigated properly, contractual obligations are enforced, and so on and so forth. This is a manifesto for a large state, not a small state, right? So it's minimalist in the range of its functions, right? So it's a state that doesn't necessarily then intervene in an array of other things around social life. The fascinating thing is, and there were real efforts to theorize this. Robert Nozick's Anarchy State Utopia was probably the most, at some level, I think, sophisticated philosophical effort to address this. And he himself, said that he came into the project with a lot of disdain for libertarianism, and yet constantly confronted, a sort of event horizon of his own thinking and sort of arguing with libertarian thought. He subsequently then, sort of went on later in life to kind of reject his own willingness to meet libertarianism more than halfway. But this was a real effort on his part to kind of think through exactly these questions about why, the sort of possibility of utopia is one in which you have this state that has very constrained functions and so forth. But he very much admitted, out of the gate, that it's going to have certain kinds of functions, right? The night watchman state, there's a lot of night watchmen and a lot of them carry big sticks, The irony, I think, in part is that, Reagan, when he came into office, actually told the National Chamber of Commerce in the United States, told businessmen that he was going to have the most protectionist government that they'd ever had in terms of business people. So again, very selective. Huge wars in Central America, right? Financing and funneling money illegally, and it was a crony state at some level as well. And so, there's a significant irony, and precisely as you point out, the repression, right, of the coal miners in England, the sort of language of the internal enemy, right, which Thatcher deployed and which was not uncommon either in the Reagan administration. All of these things are indications of a certain kind of state rather than no state. And I'll just give you another example here. Newt Gingrich, right, the sort of avatar of the craziness that U.S. politics has become. I mean, his contract with America was, it wasn't an agreement with the country. It was a contract to kill it, right? He was taking out a contract on the country, But for all of his anti-statist rhetoric, he represented an extremely rich suburban district of Atlanta that got enormous amounts of public funding, and that didn't go anywhere under Gingrich. And so they're playing to a certain audience that has a certain conception of what they mean by the state in all of this. But you're absolutely right. This is not this is not some kind of small state, stripping it down, rolling it back, all this kind of stuff. It's completely reworking where its efforts go, where its funding goes, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just big in a different way, really. What we've been talking about so far, you would place on the kind of hard right of the traditional economic left-right spectrum. Can a left-winger be a libertarian?
That's a good question. Well, it's funny, I was just thinking about this the other day. I was reading Mitchell Dean and Daniel Zamora's The Last Man Takes LSD about Foucault and neoliberalism. And pretty compelling little book, actually. And they sort of, I think they lay out a fairly persuasive scenario of kind of making sense of the 1970s and Foucault and this kind of effort to deal with a new kind of politics and thinking about the possibility of a kind of market leftism, right, which might be seen not as a contradiction in terms, but certainly a kind of problematic, a tricky arrangement to achieve. But I would also say that the libertarians that I'm looking at here, the possibility of a kind of left-wing libertarianism is, in some sense, right, we are talking more about kind of anarchist politics in some sense. And it's not like there are not examples of kind of, so a lot of the stuff I'm writing about are these exit communities, these efforts to create these private forms of governance and the like, not to sort of leap ahead. But anyway, and you certainly have different kinds of examples of those, but I don't think they're in any way comparable to the things that I'm looking at. So just to give you an example, the autonomous territories of the Zapatistas in southern Mexico as one example, right? Or, to go back historically, maroon communities of escaped slaves, right? These are in some sense, exit societies that are attempting to get away from the sort of dominant state structure, and even in certain instances, like the Zapatistas, to challenge a certain kind of nation-state paradigm. But what they're escaping or evading might be a better word, and what they're attempting to devise and create is remarkably different. Right? So libertarians are not going to, in any way, shape, or form, step out of the kind of financial structures in which they have, they've invested enormously in different kinds of ways. So I think there's that kind of variation that I think is very important. It's important to recognize the similarity in form, in other words, but not to conflate the form with the content. I think paying attention to the content of the thought and the set of practices that come along with the content, right, are important to keep in mind.
Sure. I think to some extent, the way I've always understood it is that left-wing people are libertarian in a kind of social sense. They don't want the state to interfere in, who you sleep with, the drugs you take, whether you can marry, and perhaps right-wing people are libertarian in an economic sense. I think what if I'm correct in understanding what you've just said, a concern among some left-wingers would be that the two kind of merge, to the extent that society is incredibly free in a social sense, but also there's very, very few protections for poor people economically.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I would talk about this as well, or I would suggest thinking about it, I mean, some of the folks that I write about get frustrated that I use the term right wing for them, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, right? They want to do away with draconian drug laws, and I'm totally in agreement with that. I mean, they want people to be allowed to marry who they want to marry, identify how they want to identify, and so on and so forth. But interestingly enough, right, there's a kind of genealogy to a lot of this thinking that is problematic. I mean, just to give you the example of a contemporary version of this, right? The Seasteaders, right? These are folks who have been financed by Peter Thiel. Milton Friedman's grandson, Patrick Friedman, is one of the sort of founders of the Seasteading Institute. And the idea was to try to create sovereign floating platforms on the high seas, right? The idea being, I mean, they didn't quite have this right, but that the high seas were a place open for the creation, for colonization, the creation of a certain kind of private sovereign entity. And it's complicated. They had to get a lot of money, and there's a lot of engineering issues and labor issues and so on and so forth. And they haven't been successful thus far, and they've moved much more closer to shore now, back into the sort of exclusive economic zone of island nations and the like. But part of the premise was that people should be, not constrained by the government in terms of whether it be drug use, polyamory, who you marry, so on and so forth. But the frustrating thing, of course, is that the majority of individuals who have the money to invest in these kinds of projects and support these kind of projects, they're not going to jail for drug use anytime soon anyway. And in fact, right, the people who are most persecuted by the drug war that started under Reagan are communities of color and poor communities, who, frankly, are not going to be escaping to a multi-million-dollar floating platform in the Pacific anytime soon. And so it's a disingenuous set of arguments that are being made, and I find it quite frustrating. The thing about right wing that's interesting as well, the sort of language of the right wing, or the sort of using that term, I guess, is a better way to say it. What's quite fascinating to me is the social conservatism that is embedded in the economic thought as it develops in the 1960s. And that is to say, it was white communities in places like Atlanta, but also in parts of LA, right, that are responding to, right, the civil rights movement, responding to attempts to integrate communities, affordable housing, and things like this, that, these white communities are the ones who engage in white flight and use the language of property rights as a way to couch, right, their racism. And they're using the language of the market libertarians, right, as a way to essentially engage in very reactionary politics. So my own feeling is that this distinction between a kind of right, far right economics or right wing economics and the kind of social conservative position, those things aren't distinct. I think they come together in pretty profound ways in the 1960s. And certainly you can see it in the language of some of the folks writing at the time who, are sort of on the kind of libertarian or neoliberal end of things, the fear of, urban uprisings. I mean, there's a lot of coded language, right? A lot of coded language about where totalitarianism is coming from. They're not critiquing the John Birchers, or the KKK. Right, they're critiquing social movements for trying to extend emancipation to a lot of people who continue to be oppressed and repressed. And so there's this intersection between those things that I think we shouldn't elide. Yeah.
I want to come to the modern day, Raymond. Let's talk about Elon Musk. Is Elon Musk an adventure capitalist?
Absolutely. He's someone that I don't write about as much as I might, write about, let's say, Branson, Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is certainly much more outspoken about his own libertarianism, about his own trajectory, which is always nice for someone writing because you have someone giving voice to their own kind of trajectory. But certainly I would include Musk here. You can include him not only because just of the wealth and the kinds of subsidies, that his companies have been access to public monies and the like and so forth, and the kinds of negotiations that he's tried to undertake in Nevada and elsewhere, right, to create essentially what are kind of company towns, which, aren't exactly, libertarian exit societies, but they have this, kind of interesting relationship to the state. But yeah, so I see someone like Musk very much in this. The famous tweet that he sent out about, we'll coup whoever we want when it came to the question about lithium extraction and the Bolivian government. I think it's a classic example of adventure capitalism. And if it raises in someone's mind, ITT and the coup d'etat against Allende in Chile in 1973, there's a reason that it raises that. This kind of imperialist and imperious sense, right, of capitalist self and what's good for the world, and this unremitting, unabounding faith in sort of profit and technology is very much wrapped up with someone like Musk. And of course, the contemporary language of, we're going to make the world a better place and make a whole lot of money in the process is part and parcel of this as well. I mean, I kind of see that as almost a defining characteristic of adventure capitalism. These, essentially at root, in some sense, I think contradictory positions, but that are held very strongly. I'll say one last thing about this. Another individual here that's quite fascinating in this regard is a guy named Michael Strong, probably less well known to listeners. But, Michael Strong is the sort of, again, tech Silicon Valley entrepreneur, social entrepreneur. Sometimes they call themselves radical social entrepreneurs. Strong sort of, he was involved in various things, tried to get on the ground in Honduras after the coup d'etat in 2009 to set up, free private cities. I can talk more about those if you'd like. But the thing about Strong that's interesting is, his sense of self, sort of overwhelming sense of self. He deigns himself important enough to his past, his own law, but not only his own sort of, law, but it has a corollary, right? So Strong's law about markets and business and states, and then it has a corollary. I mean, it's outrageously arrogant. And then on top of that, Strong is, he commented, I went to this thing in 2017, the Startup Societies Foundation meeting, and on the stage at that, there's a big gathering of libertarians at the City College of San Francisco, of all places, a publicly funded college. But on the stage, he said, he's tired of his friends giving him grief about the projects that he's involved in and making the world a better place and so on and so forth. And then he sort of, he said, I'm a leftist. and then he started going on about capitalism saving the world, and it's this totally bizarre ideological universe, right? And I think at some level there's that kind of disconnect amongst some of these folks, right? It's a weird sense, and I think it comes out of a sort of a long-standing North American tradition of not having people learn political economy in high school, or reading the basics. I mean, it's amazing how ignorant they are compared to their peers in Mexico or Chile or probably the UK for that matter. And so yeah. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but of course I would put Musk right in this. Absolutely.
It's really interesting what you just said about the almost either being very ignorant about how poor their knowledge is about economics, but also there's something I realized recently. I saw a photo of Musk, Joe Rogan, and Jordan Peterson on Twitter. You may have seen the photo as well. They were in Austin. The photo was taken by Michael Malice, who's another quite interesting progenitor of a lot of sort of anarchist libertarian theory in America today. But I think those other two, Rogan and Peterson, especially Rogan, you could also argue the case for them being a sort of adventure capitalist in the terms that you've put it. It struck me when I saw them, all three of them together, they're three incredibly famous, successful, wealthy people, but they all claim to be kind of under attack in some way, from the state or from certain factions within the state, from the media, the opinion forming classes, the universities is another one that they constantly talk about. And I think it goes back to something quite fundamental to American conservatism and libertarianism. There's always this anti-establishment, anti-intellectual, anti-elite mentality that's so central to it that I almost can't imagine libertarianism without it in the American context. It has such a victimhood complex to it, and always has, I think. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, it's a good question. It does strike me, at least, that part of this comes out of this long ongoing history of reckoning that's not reckoning in the United States around race and slavery, right? I mean, it's not surprising to me the sort of the vehemently the vehemence with which people are misrepresenting and attacking things like critical race theory and other kinds of things that are being taught in schools and in universities. And I think part of this comes from a kind of long unwillingness to recognize where the wealth of this country derives, right? Either from primitive accumulation in the form of the expropriation of native people's lands and livelihoods, or from the primitive accumulation and expropriation of people's labor in the backs of enslaved Africans. I mean, and at some level, I mean, I think there's a way in which this is constantly being pushed to the side. The constant effort to kind of address these histories and these issues. I mean, the 60s in part was an effort to, and you think about some of the great works of history that were written in the 60s and the 70s, right, that tried to engage with these questions. And I mean, it provokes a kind of backlash, not only amongst libertarians, of course, but I do think there's a kind of unwillingness, to recognize this long history of sort of attenuated complicity. Yeah.
The other person that I wanted to discuss with you, or the other group of people that I think fit in, especially now, to the idea of adventure capitalism is the tech giants. And Mark Zuckerberg in particular, because I think obviously people will know that recently he rebranded the Facebook holding company as Meta, and he's starting to talk seriously about this idea of the metaverse, this virtual reality world where people can escape to, and this is almost taking adventure capitalism to a completely new level. It's literally exporting yourself somewhere else, right? To an entirely different place. And it's, pitting life as an adventure, as something beyond reality. Do you think that the internet or the development of the internet has basically meant that adventure capitalists and this extreme form of capitalism will eventually, or is sort of winning the day now? Do you think that do you think there's any kind of any way of sort of rowing back from this now?
Yeah, the Zuckerberg meta curse, I think is what we should probably call it. I'm not sure. I mean, so in my own work, one of the things that I made a decision fairly early on to, in part because of sheer ignorance on my own part, of not understanding how these things work and sort of trying to understand them and not always being very particularly successful. I made a decision fairly early on to look at libertarian projects that are recognizably territorial. So we might call them analog projects instead of digital projects. But you're correct, right? This is all linked up to, in some sense, especially the contemporary projects, has close connections to Bitcoin mining, Ethereum, cryptocurrencies, less so to central bank digital currencies. But even then, there's a little bit of that sort of playing around in the margins. But I think that's, something probably more recognizable to many of us. Usually they're pegged to a national currency and so on and so forth. But you're correct. I mean, there's a lot of the, this question of singularity, right? Artificial intelligence, orbital space colonization, and the like. I mean, I think the sort of space colonization side of this is not something that's going to happen anytime soon. I remember someone writing recently about just how many people it takes on the ground to keep one person alive in space, and it's quite extraordinary. So, but a lot of this stuff, right, translating your consciousness into computer code, and this the sci-fi of Gibson and Neil Stephenson and Cory Doctorow, I find it quite compelling, and it's not these are not things that I necessarily would scoff at, but they're not things that I sort of went into and approached. But they're clearly, right, there's clearly seriousness about this. There's a lot of investment in in cryogenics, for example, and finding sites where someone's body can be stored until it can be resuscitated, and sometime in the future when the technology catches up with the possibility of resuscitation, and so forth. But the territorial projects, I mean, I think should be of immediate concern, because all of many of these experiments, the ones that I've been tracking thus far, haven't come to fruition, and a lot of them are kind of you can sort of laugh about them. I mean, they're like versions of the Fire Festival, but with this kind of political purpose. But even then, complete disasters. And they're, in many cases, they're a kind of grift, right? They're kind of efforts to just make money and come up with something new and shiny to try to get people to invest in. And so I kind of, one of the ways I put this is they're less Thomas More than they are J.W. Marriott. It's timeshare sovereignty at some level that you're looking at. You're not looking at utopia. But these experiments are unfolding, and in some places they're unfolding with fits and starts. But you're starting to see more and more discussion with national governments about ceding pieces of sovereign national territory to a board of international investors who would have oversight, that would have a kind of arbitration board rather than a judicial system, places where none of the articles of the Constitution of the state in question would apply. So essentially, these are ceding national sovereign territory to investors to create, usually, not always, but usually gated or closed communities that would have their own, kind of operating constitution and the like. I mean, the most recent place where this has been tried out is in Honduras. And it started in 2009 with Charter Cities by Paul Romer, who was most recently the chief economist at the World Bank briefly and is a economist at NYU now. But Romer's idea was, I mean, he drew from certain kinds of libertarian ideas, like these old experiments about, making citizenship something on the market, right? So that people can kind of opt in and opt out of wherever they want to be according to the kinds of laws and regulations that exist in a place. Of course, with the idea that all the rest of the noise that infiltrates those kinds of models, you have to put to the side, right? Things like immigration laws and migration laws and so on and so forth, borders. So Romer had a kind of, he's thinking about a kind of nostalgic vision of Hong Kong and things like this. But then very quickly, Romer's idea got taken up and turned into a much stronger libertarian idea, which is to essentially create these special economic zones with their own judiciary and arbitration board, overseen by international investors, their own kinds of taxation programs or lack of taxation programs, and so on and so forth. And they had a lot of support from basically what was an illegal regime that was put into place by a coup d'etat in 2009. So they were working with, this pretty authoritarian state, as you mentioned earlier. These things aren't antithetical to one another. In fact, so much so that the seasteaders, right, who were associated with some of these projects in Honduras, in 2015, they held in San Francisco this big event called Disrupting Democracy, and completely tone deaf, right, to the everyday experience of Hondurans who were suffering an extremely violent and continually violent coup d'etat. They invited the president of Honduras, of this coup regime, Juan Orlando Hernandez, to something called Disrupting Democracy. It was outrageous, just absolutely appalling, in my opinion. But those kinds of projects, they're in fits and starts, they're moving forward, and legal kinds of programs, right, are being created and generated and practiced and tried out. And so a lot of this stuff is getting experimented with around the globe. And so, and I'm not a sort of ardent defender of the nation state. But I think it's, things need to be clear about what is going to be set up in its place in some of these instances. Again, it's not just about form; it's about content.
If I can just follow up something that you said a second ago, Ray, this idea that you spoke of rich people and adventure capitalists basically taking bits of foreign countries and ensuring that their own rules apply rather than the laws and constitutions of whole countries is very worrying, because you have to ask yourself what these people want to do in these places that they can't do in the United States or Britain or kind of law-governed countries, especially after the revelations about people like Jeffrey Epstein, who were kind of setting up their own utopian societies as they saw it and doing awful things. That's very worrying, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. It is one of the issues that clearly I think people have to think about. I'll say a couple of things about this. In some instances it's fascinating, right? Because there are projects to try to set up sort of private sovereign countries on the ocean. I think I mentioned the seasteaders. And of course, they have a misreading of international law and the law of the high seas and so forth. It's not that the high seas aren't a lawless place. There are international laws that apply. But I think more generally, it is a big concern, in part because, of course, the premise of people being free, right, to be who they are and to act as they wish to act may entail acting in ways that are extraordinarily egregious and bad towards other people. Just to give you an example, one of the people that's fairly prominent at the beginning of the book that I just finished, a guy by the name of Morris Davis, by the name of Bud Davis. And he talked about this very publicly when there was an effort to dredge sand in atoll south of Tonga on the Minerva Reef and to build a kind of libertarian city there. And the idea wasn't just about hiding money and tax havenry and so on and so forth. As he put it, people will be able to do whatever they damn well please. Right? This was his kind of statement. including, opening bars without licenses, pornography, whatever they wish to do. Right? And of course, on the one hand, there's a lot of liberatory, getting out of sort of bourgeois mores, getting out of the sort of stultifying constraints of sort of, middle class values and so on and so forth. On the other hand, of course, you can see people being radically exploited and taken advantage of. And as you mentioned, Jeffrey Epstein's island, sort of the ultimate dystopia. There were efforts by a company called Blue Seed to create, they wanted to create a large floating platform, like aircraft carrier size floating platform off of Big Sur, California, south of San Francisco. But it would be just outside of the political jurisdiction of the United States. And the idea was to set it up and, as they put it, to hack U.S. immigration laws, to bypass U.S. immigration laws and bring in engineers of various kinds who could connect to what they called the Silicon Valley ecosystem via helicopter. Of course, the terrifying thing here is that what kind of protections would they have had on a floating platform, 13 miles out from the coastline and outside of political jurisdiction, in which they didn't have a visa. I mean, you could see them essentially as sort of engineering serfs on a kind of feudal aircraft carrier out in the waters. And so the implications, the potential implications for some of these kinds of projects are, I think, problematic in that respect. I'll mention one last thing, which is the case of the island off the coast of Honduras, Roatan, where there was a project underway that's went fairly far along up until about November, when an opposition politician was elected. But it wasn't clear even if things like extradition laws would apply. And I think this is part of the reason why the president at the time, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who had ties to narco trafficking, was quite a supporter of the project, because there was this concern about, he's got family members who've been convicted and so on and so forth. So yes, all of that is to say that it is, these things can be very emancipatory for some, but extraordinarily oppressive for others.
Traditionally, I think when nationalism as an idea became vogue in the sort of 19th century, it was often considered as a kind of left-wing concept especially among many Europeans, because it was a way of shielding oneself against imperialism or against kind of foreign market forces and the way that they interact with imperial adventures. Recently, nationalism, I would say, has become an idea more closely associated with the right, as a more kind of a sort of racial nationalism or an ethnic nationalism. Do you think that if these kind of radically decentralized gated communities that you're talking about become more and more commonplace, do you think that more people on the left of politics will re-embrace the idea of an overarching nation state as a way of guarding against these ultra-capitalist modes of organization?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The state has for so long been sort of beaten up on, especially since the era of Thatcher and Reagan, that it does seem in some sense, it doesn't have to be nationalistic, but in some sense, the question about the nation state and sort of what it is and what it does, maybe it deserves some reconsideration, or sort of rethinking at some level. The projects that I was just talking about, forms of those have been around for some time. You had already in the 1950s, Mike Davis in City of Quartz writes about this a little bit, but already in the 50s and 60s, you have essentially what are kind of, quasi-suburban districts of Los Angeles that are contracting out for what are traditionally municipal services. And these are generally wealthier suburban areas. And of course, they contract out instead of having their own fire service and their own police service and so on and so forth. They contract out and they basically save money on the public's dime, right? It's a kind of economy of scale argument in which instead of funding, right, because then you have to sort of retirements and pensions and so on and so forth. And so contracting this stuff out is not, it's not new, right? There is a kind of version of this. It's not of course, it's not your own private, your own private archipelago. But it is certainly, a gradual kind of form of social secession. And so what's interesting is a lot of the kind of, projects of the 1960s and 1970s of, Ernest Hemingway's brother tried to set up, his own little floating nation off the coast of Jamaica. And, it's a very, very funny thing that he did. There's a lot of these kinds of efforts, and I track a lot of them in my book, especially those of a guy named Michael Oliver. And all of this in the high era of decolonization. It's not surprising. You're looking at all these places that are decolonizing, and they're trying to sort of get in some sense, and to build these sort of utopian spaces or these private spaces. In the 1980s, a lot of these projects kind of disappear. And I think they disappear precisely because Reagan makes it, and so does Thatcher, they make it kind of easier for you to socially secede without territorially seceding. So why go through all the pain, right, of territorial secession and all the kind of complications that come with it, and so on and so forth, navigating another country's legal system and so on. And instead, they, increasingly socially secede, the creation of common interest developments, privatized homeowners, certain kinds of homeowner associations that, as well. I mean, you see these entities being created. I mean, outside of Atlanta, there's a very famous town. I can't recall the name off the top of my head, but you see these kinds of efforts, right, to increasingly separate from the broader sort of public good. So I don't think these ones, what we're watching now, are necessarily new. I think what is new about them is they're driven by this very Promethean tech ego. Right? It's the desire to, unlike I think a lot of the projects of the 60s and 70s, which, you can agree with or not agree with, but in many instances, I think, it's fair to say, to give some of those folks the benefit of the doubt, they were worried about totalitarianism. They were worried about their safety. Some of these folks had survived horrific things in their childhood and in their lives in Europe. And so they were looking to kind of protect themselves, and they wanted to protect their wealth and so forth, but they were also genuinely existentially fearful. I don't think that's the case now at all. Peter Thiel and Elon Musk aren't existentially fearful of anything. This is kind of very Nietzschean, right? It's a kind of desire to bend reality to one's will. And so I think it's got a different inflection that's important to keep in mind. But there's a long history to these things. That's a far away from your question about nationalism and the state. So, just to come back to that, I do think, right, there's a kind of, part of, I think, what's unfolding now is this kind of rethinking of the state, but without, right, necessarily a sort of embrace of projects such as these. They're not, these are not some kind of new, innovative way of thinking about the nation state and sovereignty. And I just don't buy that for a second. I think this is sheer grift capitalism. This is real estate speculation. And so, I don't see it as kind of antithetical in some sense to the state.
And obviously, with the tech element, there's also an incredible issue of ratcheting up inequality as well.
Completely. That's right.
Ray, I really enjoyed that. That was great. Thank you very much. Where can people find your work if they want to read more about this? It's a very interesting topic, and I think there's an awful, there's much more of this story to come throughout the lives of the people that are listening to this. Where can people go?
Yeah, there's a couple of places. I have some links on my Cornell History Department webpage to some writing that I've done. I did a piece called Egotopia with Counterpunch in August of 2018. I recently did an interview with Atusa Araxia Abrahamian on her Substack Terra Nullius. There's a sort of Q&A. And then on the PM Press website, pmpress.org, there's a page dedicated to the book. The book's coming out on the 14th of January, Adventure Capitalism, A History of Libertarian Exit from the Era of Decolonization to the Digital Age. And there's some information there as well about the book and some blog posts that I've done on this material. So those are some of the places. And of course, people can get in touch with me directly if they would like to. I'm certainly happy to have correspondence via email.
Ray, thank you.
Cheers. A pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you never miss new content.